Over the past decade, the 9/11 terror attacks and the war in Iraq have certainly dominated the news. From thousands killed and wounded to tremendous and often unexpected changes in the balance of power in the Middle East, Iraq has been a central topic of many of this program's most significant interviews. The subject of Iraq even came up in my first interview with then Republican presidential candidate George W. Bush when I caught up with him on the campaign trail in Iowa in January 2000, a year before he entered the White House.
It's almost exactly 9 years since your dad, the President of the United States, accepted a ceasefire with Saddam Hussein in Iraq in exchange for full Iraqi agreement to comply with UN weapons inspectors. But for the last year, there have been no weapons inspection teams in Iraq at all. If you were president today, what would you do about that?
I would continue to keep the pressure on the Iraqi government. I would continue to insist that inspectors be allowed into the country. I would continue to insist that Iraq complied with the ceasefire arrangement.
But they're in violation of the agreement right now.
Absolutely, and we shouldn't be sending mixed signals. And if any time I found that the Iraqis were developing weapons of mass destruction, they wouldn't exist anymore.
Who wouldn't exist anymore? The weapons?
The weapons of mass destruction, yes. I'm not going to... They just need to hear that from a potential president, that if we catch them in violation of the agreement, if we in any way, shape, or form find out that they're developing weapons of mass destruction, that there will be action taken. And they can just guess what that action might be.
And you're not going to spell it out here today?
No, sir.
And he didn't spell out his plans back in 2000, but as the years went by, his administration made it clear its fears of what Saddam Hussein could do were growing amid what appeared at the time, officials said, to be solid evidence of a hidden Iraqi nuclear weapons program. President Bush's national security advisor, Condoleezza Rice, and I spoke about that in September 2002. How close is Saddam Hussein's government? How close is that government to developing a nuclear capability?
You will get different estimates about precisely how close he is. We do know that he is actively pursuing a nuclear weapon. We do know that there have been shipments going into Iran, for instance, into Iraq, for instance, of aluminum tubes that really are only suited to high-quality aluminum tubes that are only really suited for nuclear weapons programs, centrifuge programs. We know that he has the infrastructure, nuclear scientists to make a nuclear weapon. And we know that when the inspectors assessed this after the Gulf War, he was far, far closer to a crude nuclear device than anybody thought, maybe 6 months from a crude nuclear device. The problem here is that there will always be some uncertainty about how quickly he can acquire a nuclear weapon. But we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud.
Tensions with Saddam Hussein continued to grow until March 2003, when the U.S. and a coalition of allies invaded Iraq and toppled his regime in a matter of only a few weeks. But no weapons of mass destruction were found. Also cast into doubt was another reason given for the invasion, possible evidence of cooperation between the Iraqi government and the terrorists of al-Qaeda. I pressed Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld on this when we spoke almost 2 years after the invasion. Listen to what you said on September 26, 2002, several months before the war. Listen to this.
We do have solid evidence of the presence in Iraq of al-Qaeda members, including some that have been in Baghdad. We have what we consider to be very reliable reporting of senior-level contacts going back a decade, and of possible chemical and biological agent training. When I say contacts, I mean between Iraq and al-Qaeda.
That was a mistake.
No, Zarqawi was in there. It was there clearly were al-Qaeda in and around Iraq.
You believe that to this day?
Zarqawi was physically in Baghdad.
But
they were operating.
Was he then, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, associated directly with al-Qaeda?
No, probably not.
So why would you say that there was a connection between Iraq and al-Qaeda?
Because the intelligence reported that there were al-Qaeda that moved in and out of Iraq and had some connection with the Saddam Hussein regime.
That was on September 26, 2002. The intelligence, your intelligence, in February 2002 said exactly the opposite. There was a DIA intelligence estimate that's now been declassified. Senator Levin released it, that said this. It is possible he does not know, referring to this intelligence source, does not know any further details. It is more likely this individual is intentionally misleading the debriefers. Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi has been undergoing debriefs for several weeks and may be describing scenarios to the debriefers that he knows will retain their interest. In effect, the DIA concluded this source, which alleged this Iraq al-Qaeda connection, was a fabricator.
There is no question but that there are fabricators that operate in the intelligence world, and that there's also no question but that you can find intelligence reports on every side of every issue. When you look at the reams of intelligence information that the United States develops from different agencies, they gather from other friendly foreign liaison services, you can find in any given week intelligence that conflicts with each other. The implication that there's something amazing about that is just ridiculous.
The basis of the intelligence, that's why the U.S. went to war, the WMD and the Iraq al-Qaeda connection that you alleged.
The reason the United States went to war, the President has announced and said it repeatedly. There were 17 resolutions in the UN that were ignored by Saddam Hussein. Our planes were being shot at on a regular basis in the Operation Southern Watch and Operation Northern Watch. Saddam Hussein was giving $25,000 to the families of suicide bombers. Iraq was on the terrorist list.
By January of last year, after a 4-year battle with insurgents, many Americans were seriously questioning the wisdom of the invasion. But the Vice President, Dick Cheney, had no doubt it was the right course of action.
Saddam Hussein would still be in power. He would, at this point, be engaged in a nuclear arms race with Ahmadinejad, his blood enemy next door in Iran.
But he was being contained. He was not being contained.
He was not being contained. Wolf, the entire sanctions regime had been undermined by Saddam Hussein.
But he didn't have stockpiles.
He had corrupted the entire effort to try to keep him contained. He was bribing senior officials of other governments. The oil for food program had been totally undermined, and he had in fact produced and used weapons of mass destruction previously, and he retained the capability to produce that kind of stuff in the future.
But that was in the 80s.
You can go back and argue the whole thing all over again, Wolf. But what we did in Iraq and taking down Saddam Hussein was exactly the right thing to do. The world is much safer today because of it. There have been 3 national elections in Iraq. There's a democracy established there, a constitution, a new democratically elected government. Saddam has been brought to justice and executed. His sons are dead. His government is gone. And the world is better off for it. Now, you can argue about that all you want. That's history. That's what we did. And you and I can have this debate. We've had it before. But the fact of the matter is, in terms of threats to the United States from al-Qaeda, for example, attacks on the United States, they didn't need an excuse. We weren't in Iraq when they hit us on 9/11. The fact of the matter was that al-Qaeda was out to kill Americans before we ever went into Iraq.
The current situation there is very unstable. The President himself speaks about a nightmare scenario right now. He was contained, as you repeatedly said throughout the 90s, after the first Gulf War, in a box, Saddam Hussein.
He was, after the first Gulf War, had managed, he kicked out all the inspectors. He was providing payments to the families of suicide bombers. He was a safe haven for terrorists, one of the prime state sponsors of terrorists designated by our State Department for a long time. He'd started 2 wars. He had violated 16 UN Security Council resolutions. If he were still there today, we'd have a terrible situation.
But there is a terrible situation.
No, there is not. There is not. There's problems, ongoing problems. But we have, in fact, accomplished our objectives of getting rid of the old regime. And there is a new regime in place. It's been there for less than a year, far too soon for you guys to write him off. They have got a democratically written constitution, first ever in that part of the world. They've had 3 national elections. So there's been a lot of success.
How worried are you,
we still have more work to do to get a handle on the security situation.